Welcome back, everybody. So this is a part 3 now of our conversation, and we'll be trying to wrap up at this point. But just to go off of Dan's point, Dan was talking about how there's an element of conservatism within American leftism or leftishism. I also wonder if there's sometimes an underestimation on the part of some leftists about where this country falls, in the grand scheme of the global, Overton window. Because I think our Overton window is far, and for people who don't know what the Overton window it's the acceptable bounds of political discourse in society generally. And so I think that when people, because one thing people will say is like the Democratic Party has been the thing that kept us from ever having a genuine Labor Party or Social Democratic Party in the way that Northern and Western European countries do. But I also wonder if that's also because of the culture in our country, and that we are a little bit more to the right perhaps than those countries generally. And so it's not so much that the Democratic Party has been what's keeping us from moving farther left so much as that they were about as left as we could go because our Overton window is more to the right than their Overton window is.
Yeah, can I jump in on that real quick?
Yeah, I'm done. Yeah.
Oh, those are such great points, man. And I think one of the things that separates American culture from a lot of other cultures, including European culture to a degree, is the American emphasis on individual determination, self-determination. Because in countries that are more heavily engaged in a lot of leftist implementation, they also have a cultural acceptance on a certain cap on individual dreams and passions. Find your passionism is a very, very American thing. And a lot of left rhetoric in America, I think particularly among millennials, is and they don't realize this perhaps, it's quite diluted by a lot of that find your passionism, because a truly leftist system doesn't catalyze those things in the way that at least they're used to. And so when with a lot of more socialized implementation comes a certain lack of self-determination. And we see this in European education systems and a lot of other education systems, in which in order to maintain these more rigid sort of structural equalities, they do provide a lot of evenness in terms of a certain opportunity by a certain measurement, but they don't provide a lot of the exact same ability to determine one's own course. Americans are very used to being able to course correct and course shift and figure out something inside of them that they want. And I think there's a paradigm that I think actually dilutes a lot of American leftism in implementation, because we like being able to make up our own minds a lot. And that's a trade-off that comes with a more collectivist approach to political infrastructure. And I think we've seen that pretty consistently as leftism has been implemented. I'm not critiquing it per se. I'm just saying American culture has been, I think, in some senses, genetically resistant to it in a lot of American history for that reason. Because all often when we come up against an imposition on choice, we hit the brakes.
Makes sense, and I would have agreed with you, I want to say 10 years ago, right? And I was as far left, maybe a little less far left 10 years ago. But when I saw 2008 change, when I saw that happen, I saw a change in the country that was very different. And leftist circles, and I'm talking far leftist circles, have been growing since then. And even in the past couple years, they've been exploding. And it might not even be that millennials are the far most left. The Zoomers that I've known have been by far, like Gen Z is way more intrigued by leftist ideas than even we are. Like, they're really, and I'm not talking, they're not intrigued by, you know, the Democrats. They're intrigued by, like, you know, egoism and, you know, like really far left political ideologies. So I think that historically, yes, we've been a little bit more quote unquote resistant to, you know, the strains of leftist thinking, but that's changing.
Yeah, I think I think there's a real possibility for that. And I think this kind of genetic change, just like genetic change in nature, you know, that these mutations can happen over time. Specifically to the question of, are millennials more leftist? I think that it's, when I hear a lot of millennials talk about their leftism, I hear them wanting to implement often leftist procedures to achieve these kind of bourgeois goals. You know, there's a and I'm interested, you know, if millennials, at least maybe somewhere in the mutation, that there's not a, it's American leftism, I think, is quite is quite, and on the millennial strata is still quite informed by conservatism in a lot of ways. Hey, my little daughter just walked in. Sorry, I'll mute.
It's the future. I wanted to, Darius, I know you had a point, but also eventually go back to what do you think a bourgeois goal is? But
right, and I might hit on that a little bit too. I think there's a section earlier where Dan was talking about how there was an element of conservatism when it comes to the left. I think that's a misnomer. I think more of what we're talking about is we're seeing a commonality of temperament. So that thing where Barack Obama, for instance, he's a constitutional law professor. And in that paradigm, he's considered to be, you know, conservative. And that has more to do with, if you think of a spectrum of temperament from, say, reactionary, meaning I'm looking back, conservative, moderate, progressive, and then revolutionary. This is the scale that, again, Sean McElwee and Ezra Klein talk about. I think the French, for example, we talked about in the last chat, that we have a similar sort of founding history where I think our structures, the two-party system, I do agree that at the end of the day, and really to Elizabeth Warren's point, our structures determine the boundary of where we go in American society. I think that's totally true. And let me just look at the notes I was taking here. And as far as course shifting and correcting, we talk about this a lot. We talked about it with the political time theory, which we're going to have a part 2 on, or like a main discussion about later. But I think appeal of this country is that traditionally when we're faced with a crisis, we're able to pivot and change in a way that stops us from sort of collapsing in on ourselves. And to Phil's point in the last part about what he thinks is going to happen, I think that's really where this conversation is coming to. Do you think that under our current structure that normal people are able to have a reasonable quality of life? And I think that's really the fundamental question to ask when deterring between, say, again, leftists and people on the right. Do you think by preserving the old system that that's the way to make sure we continue to exist and go forward? Or do you think there's something to this whole like inequality gap that is highly, highly correlated with, you know, massive amounts of polarization and conflict in the country, which I tend to fall more on that side.
And then we're about to lose Paul. Did you have a last closing remark?
I just really like the term leftish that we talked about today, that millennials do come off as not revolutionaries, but do tend to lean left in our political paradigm. And that doesn't mean that they will always be like that they won't take even a hard turn left or right. But at this moment in time, that's what it looks like in my perspective. So
Hashtag leftish. I would love to definitely get you back because you're a teacher and you're working with the Gen Zers, the Zoomers. So
yeah.
when we start to focus on them more, we'll definitely need to know more about their radicalism. I feel like we're definitely social media warriors and they're doers. They will eat people.
Yes, they say eat the rich.
Yes. Thank you, Paul.
I'll see you.
All right,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Paul.
Phil, I think you had a.
Okay,
Darius.
yeah. I wanted to just draw to a point, like, we're reaching this point in history where all of the stuff is piling on. And I think that with, COVID-19 and all of this, we're not entering a new chapter. We're just tossing this on top of all the other stress. And like, from the last government shutdown, there were a lot of government workers who still haven't been paid for time that they showed up to work. And we're talking to the tune of 5 figures, where these people showed up to work, they did their job, and they still have not gotten paid. And if you don't think that that doesn't weigh on their minds every day, that screw job that they got handed, that's kind of where I'm coming from. You've got, because Darius was just talking about how, is this viable for people? And you see this inequality rising, and you see people getting more tense, you see people getting more polarized. And I think that is the cause of it. I think that polarization is caused by the economic inequality. And when you have a guy in power who screwed people out to the tune of 5 figures, there's social physics on that one. It's like that rubber band is tense, it's pulled, and it's either going to snap or it's going to snap back.
Now, what jobs are we talking about? Are we talking with contractor jobs? Are we like people in the White House, Oval Office, or people in the streets?
All of the above.
Okay.
Like all of the above. And I am talking about positions where people carried firearms. I'm talking about those level of positions where you're talking about, people who have there's different types of power. These are the people who, though, they have the only power that really matters, which is the boots marching power. They're young enough and they're strong enough that they can march, they can dig trenches, they can do all of that stuff. And the people who have the political power and the financial power, they don't have that. That's the one thing that they don't have. But when that boots marching power comes on the board, the other two power sources, they go away.
Tommy, what do you think?
I'm just trying to figure out what he's talking about, because I haven't heard about this, about workers not getting paid in the federal government. And I'm also curious who he's talking about with boots on the ground, because the only other people I'm trying to think of that would have guns other than the military would be like, the FBI and border security. So I don't know what he's referring to have an opinion on it.
We're talking about like federal agents. Yeah.
Okay. But where did you hear that they weren't getting paid?
From their mouths.
But I still feel like that, even if, and I will say I don't share your prediction on this, but even if something like that were to happen, my feeling is that they would do it in an effort to preserve and reform the institution.
Sure. Yeah.
To tear it down. So So
but
again, just to back to my earlier, I think you're right, Darius, that I did do a little conflation between conservative temperament and conservative philosophy.
Right. But I think you had a point there, though.
but even in that regard, though, I think that the conservative impulse there would be to preserve the institution and to house
preserving an institution is different when you're on the inside of it. Preserving an institution, like let's say the FBI or the ATF, right? That means preserving that departmental institution. In a lot of ways, those guys are just as opposed to and just as annoyed by Congress and the presidency and the Supreme Court as the people in Michigan or the people who are 3%ers. It's not that they don't hate what the federal government is doing. They just hate different things about it.
A lot of people from a lot of different directions hating the federal government, but from different angles. And I'm not making a prediction that this will happen, but when we were talking about like what could happen if this played out, I think we might be seeing it now with the way that some of the states have been responding to COVID-19 in the absence of to borrow Obama's tweet, a coherent national plan. You have some of these multi-state pacts where the northeastern states have been working together. And you have the Western states now having multi-state pacts. And I know that like in the past, again, I'm not making a prediction that this would happen, but I have played around in my mind how, if it would be better off if the country did break apart into the different regions that are more closely, and not even necessarily breaking apart in the sense that they become completely different sovereign nations, but at least in the sense of drastically drawing down the federal government and a lot of the social and social service type of things and Social Security and Medicare and all those things, like being a part of a regional government, and they deal with those things because these are such intractable issues at the national level because we have such regional difference. And I know it's not, I know people will say it's not regional differences, it's actually like, the rural urban divide and things like that, but generally speaking, there's a good bit of difference culturally, because as Paul was saying, about how, he's left for Missouri, and, I talked to someone who's, right-leaning in Connecticut, and that's different than the people that I've met who are right-leaning in Mississippi. I'm like, those are, and even the people that I've met that are left-leaning in Mississippi are, they're kind of closer to the people that would consider themselves right-leaning in Connecticut. And so I wonder if all things being considered, if it wouldn't be a net positive if regions started trying to have a line more and maybe trying to back off of these different regions trying to impose their will on the other different regions. And even if that's not what they're trying to do, I think that's how it feels. I think that maybe that might be why the South, not to pick on the South, but I'm like, in my opinion, I just feel that they're a very reactionary region. But I also feel like that's the result of them feeling like the North has been imposing their values on them for so much of history that I think it's an understandable reaction where they're like, no, this is not working for me.
With 2 points, I feel like Dan may have a point coming up. Do you follow up to that or response?
Well, actually, more of a question about it,
okay.
which
okay.
That breaking up of alignments into smaller increments. Again, forgive me if I'm misusing the term here, but that actually sounds like a somewhat conservative response. It's not internationalist. It's a way of
right.
It is,
it actually it fights against my impulse of that. I wish that there was more international cooperation. And so, like when Britain was leaving the EU, I was like, oh, this is unfortunate. But I think on the one hand, I love the idea of devolution and trying to make sure that power is left to the lowest entity that can responsibly and effectively and efficiently respond to the issue. And so I do like keeping power to the lowest level possible. On the other hand, I do think that there are issues that require larger entities that cover more regions to address them as effectively and efficiently as they can. And that includes that I am also, on the other hand, someone who also wishes that there was more international cooperation.
Right. To that point, there's a concept. This guy, I don't know if you guys have heard Nick Hanauer. He's a super progressive, like, billionaire. Nick Hanauer and Eric Liu, they have this concept, middle out economics. And one concept they have is big what, small how, which is basically, the federal government provides the resources, and you look for the smallest sort of unit of organization to actually decide on the details of how to do it, which I think is more what you guys are talking about.
Yeah. Did you want to add to that? I was just going to really quickly say that I think that that's one thing. I do love the idea that you hear from a lot of conservatives about the states being, laboratories for democracy, and allowing them to try to implement things in their own way and coming up with best practices. I think that's one of the best ways that you do find out what's the most efficient and effective way to address these issues, is when you have different states and different localities trying to chart out their different areas, and then coming together and analyzing them and being like, who addressed this the best. I would just say that in terms of the government just providing the resources, I would also say that I think there should also be some guidelines, probably, or at whatever level it is, whether it's at the federal or this regional government that I'm talking about, that you probably want to have some guidelines in line about like what the goal should be, and then like letting the states or localities figure out how to achieve those.
I want to go around the room. I'll start with Dan. Basically, get into final thoughts. Where do you want things to go post-corona, politically speaking, for us millennials?
I don't really know. Honestly, I don't really know. I think that the states are becoming more active and visible now, because we have a bad king. But I'm also interested if we had a good king or a good queen, would the focus of competence go back onto the presidency, as it often does? So, I don't know how. I have no predictions as to how the structure of the government will change, if at all. My feeling would be that people would more likely attempt a sort of more simple classic regime change, and that would sort of echo into, more lasting structural changes, if there are any after that. But that the sort of ascendancy of the states and local regions right now is because of an anemic federal response, and that I think a lot of people probably just very simply feel that if we had a different president, if they're inclined to feel this way, then things would be better. And so rather than sort of gutting the mechanics of the system, that we just sort of need a new captain. And I, for one, I really, really hope that the economic fallout and the personal fallout from people, that the population fallout doesn't get to a point where we have to make a structural change for that reason. I hope, I think that there have been awful oversights in the American response, but I also think we've benefited from this sort of stratified response, and that it sort of remains to be seen. So, because we're not at catastrophe yet, we're at terrible dilemma. And so I don't know where things ought to go. I definitely hope for a lot more competency, and how to get that exactly, I haven't quite solved yet.
Well, it seems like in this video, I'm seeing that there's a lot of commonality amongst us. It's all about basically the role of government. It's not the classic issues-driven identity things that a lot of maybe baby boomers are fighting about. The cultural war issues that bring them to the polls and have them vote for or against. So I look forward to unpacking what will make us different politically speaking, what will divide us, what will be the new cultural wars after we get over the current hump. So thank you for watching Generational Talk, guys.
Thank you.
We're definitely going to do this again. Hope to bring some of the people like Dan, Phil back for more discussion.